Chapter 4 Sarah Howell had no car, which is a considerable hardship in a place like Alabama, which sets great store by automobiles, and where the possession of one is not deemed a luxury but an absolute necessity. The supermarket does not make deliveries in Pinecone. There is no public transit system and no taxi service since 1937, and it had been a failure and a joke even then. In the newer parts of town, the municipal government had not even bothered to put up sidewalks, for who walked? School children, perhaps, when they lived not more than a block or so from the school, and even then, only in the finest weather. Dean and Sarah had had a car when they married, of course, and then they had ridden in it down to Panama City, Florida, for their honeymoon. They stayed in a miserable, light cottage in a complex of many such small rundown buildings collectively called the Bide-A-Wee Inn. The Bide-A-Wee was not very expensive, and it was just across the highway from the Gulf of Mexico, and Dean and Sarah had enjoyed themselves very much, walking up and down the beach, fishing off the great pier. At night they played carpet golf or lost themselves in an arcade that boasted over 150 pinball machines. A mechanized gypsy in a glass case had pointed to the jack of clubs with a broken finger and then promised Sarah a long life, ample fortune, and many friends. The 1959 Ford Country Squire station wagon got them to Florida, and it got them back to Pinecone. It lasted through the first 10 months of their marriage, and would probably have seen Sarah through the 3 years that Dean was scheduled to be away from her, had he not smashed it to junk the night before he was to leave for Fort Rucker. He was drunk, in the company of 2 young men who were not going into the army, and driving without headlights, had plowed into a fence post about 8 miles outside of town on the property belonging to Jack Weaver, a not very prosperous pig farmer. Mr. Weaver was understanding when he learned that Dean was going to go into the army the next morning, and his wife Merrill bound up the foreheads of Dean's 2 companions with much sympathy. Then all 3 men rode back into Pinecone in the back of Mr. Weaver's pickup truck, but the country squire was left in a drainage ditch until it was taken away about 2 months later by somebody who wanted the parts. Dean left for Fort Rucker before dawn without telling Sarah about the accident. She was very surprised not to see the car in the front of the house the next morning when she needed to go to work, but supposed that one of Dean's companions had had to drive her husband home the night before and had kept the automobile overnight. She learned the truth when she talked to the wife of one of these men at the plant on morning coffee break. If there had been any way of getting in touch with Dean right then, Sarah thought she would have yelled at him for not having told her. An accident was an accident. It was even excusable that he had been drunk, but there was no justification for his cowardice in keeping the news from her. But when she wrote to him that night, she could only think how depressed Dean had been about going off to Fort Rucker, and of course there was the possibility that he might not come home alive from Vietnam. Sarah had not had the heart to bring up the car to him, except in passing asking what she should do about the insurance. No insurance money was forthcoming, for Dean had not carried collision coverage. All of Sarah's money went into the household expenses, and she had none to spare, especially not the kind of money that is needed for car payments. Dean's checks from the army were meager. He kept half for his incidental expenses, and the other half went directly to his mother. Sarah saw not a penny of these funds, and Joe explained to her daughter-in-law, "I told Dean you didn't need the money, and you don't. You make a lot more than him. You got your mama and your daddy's insurance money laid up somewhere, and if you really wanted a Cadillac Eldorado, I know you could take a bus down to Mobile and walk right into the Cadillac showroom and drive that thing right off the floor. There's not a reason in this world for Dean to send you money when you don't need it, and I can't work, and I'm not going to be getting Social Security for another 8 years and 4 months. unless I go blind, and then I'll get it sooner. Sarah had explained to her mother-in-law many times that her parents had left only enough money to pay for their funerals and to discharge their debts. There had been none left over for Sarah herself. Joe had always told Sarah in return that she didn't believe a word of this. Sarah had stopped trying to convince her, and when Joe now demanded every other day that Sarah go out and buy a Cadillac Eldorado, Sarah merely said, "Joe, I can't afford a glove to put in that glove compartment." Sarah was again fortunate in living next door to Becca Blair, for Becca was always pleased to take Sarah whenever she needed to go, and if she wasn't available, Becca's daughter, Margaret, had strict instructions to make the purple Pontiac available to Sarah at any time. This was no great hardship on Becca. However, for the two women maintained schedules that were quite similar. They went to work and left at the same time, needed to go to the grocery store as often, and had just as soon do it together anyway. And whenever Joe bore down particularly hard on Sarah, usually every weekend, when Joe and Sarah were in the house together for many uninterrupted hours, Becca was more than happy to drive Sarah around the country until she had recovered herself. Sarah grew to think of the front passenger seat as her own, and learned how to open the glove compartment box of the car without all the little statues of Virgin Mary and St. Christopher tumbling out onto the floorboards. Most days after work, Sarah would ask Becca to drive around Pinecone once before they went home. Sarah always said it was because she wanted a little fresh air, having been cooped up in the factory all day, and Becca every day agreed cheerfully, exclaiming, "What a good idea, let's do it," as if it was the first time that Sarah had asked for such a thing of her. Becca was sure in her own mind that Sarah simply didn't want to have to return directly to the house where Josephine Howell was waiting for her.